On this episode, Scott, Tyler, and myself welcome Bri Rolston, cybersecurity researcher at Idaho National Labs. We will be discussing defending against supply chain attacks. Stay tuned. This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network. Welcome to the Below the Surface podcast all about supply chain and firmware security. This is episode number 18. I'd like to welcome my good friend, Mr. Tyler Robinson. Tyler, welcome.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here. We have an awesome guest and segment today. I am super excited.
I am excited as well. Hopefully Scott can join us. He was in some travel conundrums, so hopefully he'll be able to join us hopefully mid-show. Quick announcement. Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclypsium by visiting eclypsium.com/go. There you will find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can also sign up for a demo. All that at eclypsium.com/go. By day, this mild-mannered blue hat researcher works at Idaho National Laboratory and specializes in defensive and security engineering research and threat response. She bounces back and forth between security research, telecommunications IT and ICS OT, and security operations, incident response, threat management, risk analysis and remediation, vulnerability management, and much more. To prevent her boredom from settling in, she has trained a number of ISCS/OT incident response teams, including DHS and DOE, and worked on hundreds of incidents on all 16 critical infrastructure sectors. Bri, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yes, it's so nice to have you on. We learned a little bit about your background in the introduction, but Bri, tell us about how you got into information security and came to work where you do today.
All right, so I started off in telecommunications work, but in 2000, when I moved out to Idaho, I started with the Idaho National Labs Cybersecurity Operations Group, which was stood up after Moonlight Maze, the first of the APTs we saw. And that was the Russian one. My first 2 weeks on the job, I was like, oh, okay, this is not too bad. We hired an intern, Jason Larson, who is one of the top ICS hackers in the world right now, or researchers in the world. It's like, wow, you suck, Bri. Why did they hire you? And that's just been motivational.
Was that done motivationally on purpose?
Have you met Jason?
Okay.
No. We're actually.
I was going to say from Jason, no.
Yeah, no, we recovered, but it was actually really motivational. So one of the things that he pushed and I needed, we had a whole bunch of software developers, Cray, admins, network administrators, Novell people that we got to train with. And this was before security was there were a couple universities offering IT security programs. But there wasn't a lot of conferences. Internet wasn't a thing. So it was interesting to learn. I am very happy with the experience I had because when we started off in security operations, I actually had to learn how to do the administration work, what common failures there were, and then how to do the security. Now, I broke absolutely everything I touched the first 2 years. And really, there were days when I went home
it's painful. It's painful, but it is how you learn, Bri. I think people have this kind of grandiose idea that I'm going to get into this, everything's going to be great. Like, no, you're really going to learn because you're going to break stuff, and that's fine.
Yeah. So I had that whole wow, you suck. Why do they hire you? And then for a while, for that first 2.5, 3 years, my team lead called me crash and burn.
I was called a cowboy because I used to just go and do stuff and break stuff when I was a Unix admin. So I'm right there with you.
it's reassuring to hear that because I don't touch other people's computers when I'm doing like instant response stuff anymore because I'll forget what I'm doing, not document, and then play around, and it's broken. And after complaining to everyone about, oh, you have to document why this is why you're doing it. We have to be able to track what's happened before, what types of outages have occurred. For me to be the one breaking things without documentation is just ironic. And then karma comes around and smacks you around. That's what I've learned about computers.
Yeah, that's very true.
Karma comes to get you.
Yep. So what do you do today for I know?
Right now, the beautiful thing about working with the national labs as a researcher is I get to dabble pretty much in whatever I want to in different spaces. So just this year, I worked on electric vehicle charging and EV charging threats, looking at different types of malware that we can expect to see, what we think the attack paths will be, how people will move and pivot out of those. I've done a whole bunch of work over the last 3 years on small modular reactors and fission batteries, digital twins. Let's see what else. Looking at some of the malware hitting critical infrastructure. Like one of my favorites is Volt Typhoon. We get to support other federal agencies. So that's also fun because those projects are a little different. I got to go out and look at the Navy's laser test lab.
That's cool.
One of their test labs. I was like, ooh.
Don't let her touch that.
They did. So when I went into the building, it was really kind of cool because they had their calibration lab. They had a couple other things there. But they had this laptop sitting on the side of the table, like just when you walked in the door, and it had probably a 4-inch diameter hole right through the middle of the screen. I was like, dude, what happened here? Because it wasn't a fracture break. It was actually a clean melted edge on the monitor. And they're like, oh yeah, there was an incident. Don't you guys have safety people? Because we'd be in so much trouble if that had happened.
Right. Yeah.
A big incident.
Yeah. So I've got to do that. I'm currently working on our new program called Cyber Shield, which is DOE is funding security assessments for renewable energy sites. So I've gotten to look at a couple. I got to look at a battery management site, which was really interesting to see what the components are going to be, how they have to manage it. I'm trying to think what else.
I want to talk. Do you think that's going to be an attack surface? That's a huge initiative and probably one of the most important initiatives, I think, from critical infrastructure from a nation standpoint. Like getting those, like we're already behind the curve, right? We need to be doing this 10 years ago, which we were. But this initiative to do testing, do you think that the supply chain and components and the things that we are not thinking about for all of these pieces of critical infrastructure, you think they're going to play into the political kind of framework and or what we're going to be facing from a cyber threat and attack surface management in the future?
Okay, I'm going to try to be tactful here. So I've worked with ICS teams for a really long time. And much like software developers, they're very focused on solving a problem. They want to make something and they want to solve a problem. I call it the maker mindset. When you are in a maker mindset and you're a very, very maker oriented, it's hard to imagine why someone would want to break things. It's just not something they understand. They're so focused on building something cool that solves a problem that day to day people run into all the time. So with energy storage, if we're going to have renewables in play, we have to have some way to do baseload generation. Energy storage offers a way to offset that. We're going to see that kind of movement. Now, getting those systems onto a NERC certified network, that's harder, especially if you are a maker and aren't used to writing code securely, or you weren't aware that NERC CIP was that critical.
Do you think that's the only secure regulatory body or framework that we should be evaluating for maybe a more agile ecosystem? Do you think there are other alternatives? Are we looking at other alternatives?
I use compliance like NERC CIP to double check to make sure my architecture or my software security work is I haven't missed anything basic, right? Compliance is not supposed to drive design. It's supposed to drive your audit. Like, did I catch everything? Did I miss anything that was just obvious I just happened to forget? It's a way to help keep you organized and keep you honest. So no, I don't think that NERC is a great architectural driver, and it's because it's being used that way, much like we're seeing with some of the NIST standards.
Yep.
We're going to have gaps.
What I was refer to.
Right. But the application security work that has been going on since XP Service Pack 2, the Microsoft SDL, OpenSAM, BSIM, the training available for developers now is incredible. But most of them just don't seem to get is, why would someone break this? Oh, my code's not going to be, it's not going to be the problem because no one uses it. Or, oh, it's sitting behind a firewall, or someone else takes care of it. Until those issues are addressed, supply chain is going to be harder.
Yeah, because I think the developer mindset for supply chain or engineering mindset is, well, I got this component from somewhere else. Well, of course they secured it, so I should put it in my stuff, and it should be secure.
Those AMI chips and the code there.
Cool. Right, and then see this other thing that's interesting when we talk about in the security world as a whole. When we talk about supply chain, most people are really referring to software supply chain. But Monte Elkins demonstrated it at DEF CON like 10 years ago. He hacked his drill and made it play the Star Wars theme song with the Imperial March, whatever it's called. Like, the drill had firmware in it. He could do something with it. So when we talk about supply chain, what part are we talking about and who owns what? What part of the life cycle are you doing the supply chain review in? Because that affects how we're going to be able to do risk management as a whole for software systems and then major networks. And I don't know that the ICS and OT space is going to be any different than the IT space when it comes to this, except we tend to keep the computers around a lot longer. Because if you've got a scale, for example, under the road, if you're an ag company, and I worked in situations like this, scales under the road, it's hooked to a computer that is running a very outdated operating system. It's been running for the last 20 years. It's only used for the 8 weeks of harvest. Trucks come in full, they go out light, they weigh, they get their billing. Unless you're going to rip out the ground, rip out and put a new scale in, what are you going to do with it? That's something I don't know.
That's the design of ICS, right? Like, that's the whole point of many of these systems, and that's been the long mindset. So how do we as a country and or as a community with inside of InfoSec start to drive this conversation a little bit harder if those are the requirements that we're going by, and we still have the constraints of, we need to be building these at cost, and we got budget, and it's maybe cheapest bidder, and you start to talk about government, and we won't get down to the procurement down there, but like that supply chain and the ability for all of the integrated parts, the manufacturers there, the code running on each individual chip, and these may have hundreds of thousands that are going to run for 25 years that could affect a war and our ability to protect ourselves as a nation and provide critical infrastructure. Like, at the highest level, these things have to be dealt with now because of that 25-year span. So are these wars driving this conversation better because we're seeing some of the players start to use these particular tools in their tool set for wartime?
So I will tell you that since the release of the public information about Stuxnet was released in 2010, most of the ICS vendors have really gotten on board. They have application security programs. Their vendors are trained. They're aware. They release hardening guidelines. That's a big deal. But it takes a long time for code to change over, right? Especially the bigger the code base, the longer it takes. But the closer to hardware the code resides, the more security tools actually help address code quality, code stability, functionality, reliability, scalability. That's a big issue. So if I'm working with a software team versus a system team or an ICS network or engineering team, talking to them about that makes it easier for them to understand. I'm not really looking for just security gains. I'd like you to improve your code so everyone can see how well it works. This is important. But changing that, like that mindset, so makers understand. Like, we saw this in the first of the Ukrainian attacks. What was that, 2015? that the makers who were the adversarial engineers, because when you're attacking ICS systems, you actually have to have you drop two payloads. The malware that gets dropped on the system is actually just, the door that the engineer, adversarial engineer, walks through to affect the physical process. Having malware on every single ICS system does not guarantee critical impact occurs. So if that's the case, I can let the malware run as long as it's not affecting the physical process. But we saw in 2015, when they dropped the second payload, the engineering and physics payload, that the engineers had a hard time understanding kind of why they should be doing it. They're reluctant. That was a training run, most likely. I did not work that incident, so I don't know for sure. But looking at some of the activities that happen, that's a contrast between what makers and breakers do and how you have to train them to work together. As a defender, that works to my advantage. The other thing that works to my advantage, again, especially the closer to hardware you are, like with an embedded device, a control system, a cell phone, a satellite, you're really affecting a physical process or something that's low enough level that when you're running a test hit, you brick the system, you cause impact that we can identify and do something about. So, yes, even though we're seeing more attacks against control systems and the supply chain for critical components, for critical infrastructure sectors across the world are seeing more activity because there's more interest, I still think there's a lot we can do about it. Because if someone can hack it, I can do something. If we can detect the physical changes to the physical process before critical impact occurs, I can still do something about it. The other part of it is there are so many computers out there now that there's no possible way, and I don't care how big your team is, you can control everything you really want to. So if we can keep them, find out when someone's broken into a system, kick them out, and force them to reacquire, we've bought ourselves some time to do some hardening and learn what they're doing. As long as I'm better today than I was yesterday, or my network is, or my code is, my supply chain is, we're still ahead. But
yeah, Bri, it's interesting. You remind me of when you talk about that, because we chatted about this topic earlier, is that in my Android TV, air quotes, research, right? It was mostly other people's research that I was validating. It came down to, I had this device and it had stage 0 malware in it. And I could see it reaching out over the network trying to resolve a domain that someone had taken down the C2 infrastructure for. So it's essentially neutered at this point. Now, it bugs me, how did it get in there in the first place, right? That's a different problem from doing the response, because conceivably this device could live, and as long as I monitor that this domain never resolves, the device is probably fine. Now it's going to take a software update over the internet.
What was that domain?
I can send you. I don't remember those off the top of my head. And I'm not sure who took it down or how they took it down, Tyler, right? And I have since unplugged that device, and I'm like, no, I'm wiping this thing, clean. But there is some, I think what you're pointing at, Bri, is there's some wiggle room in there, right? That, supply chain security is never going to be perfect. And because of that, we need to do some things further down the stream that put us in a better position.
Yeah, but security work, defensive work especially, is always, okay, yeah, you found a short-term problem, like you had a breach. That's really a short-term, I need to contain this, I need to make sure bad things don't happen. And then we have midterm. What do I need to do to make sure this doesn't escalate and cause impact outside of just the hack itself? Like, they got access, they leaked data. That's really a midterm response. That's a midterm response need. And then there's long-term. Did I do root cause analysis well on all the issues that contributed to my problem? Did I understand that? And did I commit to fixing it?
Do you have control to fix that? That's another question that has to be answered, right? Do you have the ability to control whether or not that can be fixed based on your supply chain and what you're fixing?
Right. Okay, but risk management isn't about fixing everything. Risk management is about deciding, do I need to fix it? If I do, what's an acceptable level of fix? Do I need to fix it all the way and resolve the issue? Can I mitigate it? Can I, like Paul was saying, okay, the C2 domain is down. So I can plug it in, I can have it talk, and then maybe, as long as I don't know if the C2 is coming back up, I just pull a power plug on the TV and it can't talk until I allow it to, and I've had a chance to double check it. There's lots of ways for us to do something. And
yeah, it's about assurance. I'll give you another example too. I bought a Hack RF from AliExpress, and my fear is that the hardware that we get, that we may source from places like AliExpress, right? Now my spidey senses are tingling, and I'm like talking to my friends, what can I do? What can I do? And they're like, well, interrogate it using the Hack RF software. That's your first check. Second thing is update the firmware. Even if it's update, like overwrite the firmware, put your known clean firmware on there, and that's a reasonable assurance. Could there be something inside that is going to reinfect it? Maybe. But to your point, Bri, in the risk equation, like I've decreased my risk profile now by taking some of those steps. And to Tyler's point, like that doesn't always work, but it increases your assurance in that device, your trustworthiness of that device.
But I think that one of the things we have to talk about, if we're going to talk about supply chain, because supply chain can mean so many different things. Even if we talk about digital supply chain, are you talking about software? Are you talking about any device that can talk on a network? Are you talking about something that's just within your business group's responsibility, like my ICS OT supply chain, or if I'm on the server team, my hardware and firmware supply chain? Because I can't do anything about that if I didn't write the code. I mean, there's just nothing I can do. So what's an acceptable level of risk? And how important is the system to me? I think we have to be really realistic. The engineering teams, especially manufacturing, have done a good job with keeping risk management. They don't use fear, uncertainty, and doubt to drive things. It's very data-driven, and they're pretty practical. Yep, this piece of equipment is coming up on end of life. We have to do extra maintenance for it. If we get to the point that we're doing this much maintenance on it every day, we're still having these problems that cause disruption or product quality issues, then we're going to do something about it. But right now we have an imperfect piece of equipment that doesn't work right all the time. We just have to deal with it.
Yeah,
in cyber,
it's interesting you say that, Bri. Like, and I've included some of this in presentations I've given, is that we're not going to write all the software ourselves. And we're not going to certainly like acquire or build all the hardware ourselves. Like at a certain point, we're going to have to trust the supply chain. And what can we do so that we can have a much higher degree of trust? Because we're not going to reverse engineer everything that we get, and we're not going to write all of our own software. The supply chain is very real today in all forms of computing.
Yeah, and there's just so many.
I think a lot of that's education, though, too. We're having these conversations, right? Like we step back and we look at big-term, long-term strategy. Like one of the things that, like Bri, yourself, you've come up through the ranks, you've broken stuff, you've learned how to fix it, you've learned how to build it first, you've learned all the different things. We have to short-circuit that for the next generation and the amount of people coming into this, and we have to find better ways to do that. And that happens through a lot of the education and, frankly, conversations like this. People aren't often thinking in the meaningful and strategic and, we'll say, experience-driven thought processes that many of us have gotten over decades, where we don't have decades to teach that. So just in the supply chain, just in the ICS and OT frame, we really have to educate and make sure that we are communicating, articulating that risk. But I like what you're saying there about the FUD. We don't do in cybersecurity. Maybe that's why we've gotten this wrong, is it's been qualitative and not quantitative in our ability to articulate what the actual risk is and how we got to those metrics. We don't do metrics. We do fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
Okay, so I'm going to jump on my soapbox, which I had told myself I would try not to do, but it irritates me to death. Like, it just drives me crazy that when I hear someone talk to me about cybersecurity, one of the first things they pop off about, well, there's a whole bunch of vulnerabilities. Okay, well, let's get real here. Vulnerabilities are used to open the door on a system and get someone who might be guest or remote access, admin, maybe on that system. But we're seeing exploit chains where you have to change 6 different exploits or 6 different attack techniques to break from that vulnerability into admin and root. Okay, they rooted the system. Real damage doesn't occur to the company or to the system just because they got admin. That's not it. That's not damage. So why are we talking about zero breach? That wasn't realistic like 20 years ago. It's certainly not realistic now, given the amount of code we're seeing, the number of equipment we're seeing, the number of ways there are to attack. and the real lack of defense at like the firmware level. Okay, so stop telling me about the number of vulnerabilities on a system. Now, I am interested in that because it tells me about code quality and what you as a vendor are able to do. But one of the things that I've done before when I was working at a hosting company is write into my contracts with big vendors, hey, because at the time HP had an ActiveX control in their, was it ILO or iDRAC? I can't remember which one theirs is.
It's ILO, yeah. HP's ILO.
Right. So I went to the legal team, and I can't believe I'm saying that. I voluntarily went to the legal team and I explained, look, we need to write our contracts with these guys that if they're not going to fix this stuff and have workable patches for us within a certain amount of time, we're going to transfer the risk to them. That's a valid approach to risk management. You can mitigate it, you can resolve it, you can transfer it, you minimize. I mean, we don't have to fix everything. The other thing I think is important is, especially when we talk about supply chain, I as a defender control my entire environment. I might not control the code on each piece of equipment, but I have a lot of room to do something about the most common techniques and tactics used by attackers against stuff that I consider high value in my environment. So what I mean by that is you have to know your environment, but so do the hackers. So let's use that to our advantage. Let's go ahead and start talking about what I as a defender can do and how if I make little changes, I sometimes force them off their game. They have to run a reacquisition channel. Like we saw with Indestroyer, which was used in the second Ukrainian blackout. They actually had 3 modes that thing ran in. Driver mode when they first got access. Guess what? That's not kernel. Then they had it. Then they elevated to kernel mode. But they also had a reacquisition mode. So if they had lost control of the system for 2 weeks through patches or network changes, because those guys have to deal with a dynamically changing environment that they don't really know. Why aren't we using that too? But the reacquisition channel was Notepad calling it HTTP key, custom HTTP protocol out to a third set of IP ranges. My question for the ICS teams I've talked to about this, why are you allowing your control systems on Purdue Model Level 2 to make HTTP calls out to anyone on the internet? Shame on you for not blocking that. You know what your traffic looks like. It's a fairly static environment. Let's talk about those things we can do, and let's talk about the cleanup that we can do as defenders so we have better visibility. Like, you have to solve the little problems every day instead of just letting them ride.
Yeah, the visibility it's an interesting one, Bri, because we've been talking a lot about the NetScaler vulnerabilities. And for me, I think teams are caught off guard with this particular vulnerability and exploit because of the lack of visibility into these into the NetScaler platform, right? And I don't want to go blaming the Citrix or go blaming all the enterprises that have implemented it, right? But from what I've talked with the people, it's lack of visibility, which is why malicious actors are going after this platform, because I think they're understanding that there's a lack of visibility and they can dwell there for some time and in effect achieve their goals as attackers. And we need to increase our visibility into these systems to get ahead of it, is the first part of it, right?
Right, and it's not like, I mean, again, because I work with engineers, there's a very thorough, let me go ahead and put it that way, very thorough approach to fixing problems. They'll break it down when they're doing root cause analysis. There may be 7 or 8 different types of issues that contributed to that failure. Then I'll be like, is it a people, is it a process, or a technology issue? And who's going to do what to fix it? When are we going to have that done? We don't do that in IT and cyber world. We just don't. And software development is closer to that, but we still don't fix stuff all the time when we see it. We just let it ride until, well, I'm too busy. Well, when are you going to do root cause analysis and say, oh, look, I've got a vendor problem. My vendor doesn't harden their product. Because the vendor needs to write their code securely. They need to provide services securely for me. But they also need to write their product so it can be deployed securely within my environment and provide me guidance on how to do that. And then I take over. Why aren't our handoffs better between service provider and owner? Or why, if we think we don't have a lot of visibility to NetScaler, Citrix has done a lot of work over the years to say, here's training, here's documentation, here's what's available about my product. I would ask, when we're looking at those issues, was a lack of visibility because we didn't have the tools to see it, we didn't know to look for it, or we were only looking for exploit traffic against that vulnerability, or maybe we didn't have visibility because we didn't understand how the product works? What's the visibility problem? Because if you don't get down to that level, how do you fix it? How do you even begin to
put a lot of that back on the vendor, though, right? Like, I would say over the years, the vendors have not always known. They've not done a great job. There's institutional knowledge, but it's one or two people. But that also trickles down into their customer base. So it becomes an exponential problem. Then people leave that customer base. They have experience. They're hired at the next place for that experience, but they don't have any additional training or knowledge around, like you're saying, that visibility. So we've built a lot of tools and we've built a lot of great features. They've gotten so cumbersome, so complex, and the interoperability between the myriad of tools that we have ends up becoming a crutch, and it becomes our Achilles heel, to where we are not getting any good visibility because we have so much option and not using any of it in the appropriate manner.
And that, I mean, that's a depressing thought, because it's true. I mean, it's why we have alert fatigue. It's why incident threat response, the SOC teams, there's high turnover on those teams because it's a never-ending battle for stuff you can't fix all the time. So I guess one of the things we look at is then like a VDI that you're letting someone log into so you don't have to provide a remote laptop. You're providing something that's a very complex piece of software. So writing a network stack securely, writing anything that parses data or transforms data, or writing WYSIWYG rendering step to put stuff, or you're having to transmit between buses, that's hard to do well because there's so many inputs, so many outputs, the code, you never know what you're depending on. Okay. But again, let's talk about zero breach. If they got in, the vulnerability was used against you, you need to go back to the vendor and talk and say, okay, why wasn't this caught? And ask, is this something I need to keep an eye on in the future? And do I need to do it right now? And while the patch is being deployed, or do you need to keep an eye on it for 90 days? Because exploit code morphs pretty quickly. Have an idea of what kind of problem you're looking at and how critical the system you're looking at, how important it is to your business, is important, but also saying zero breach isn't realistic. I can't stop every breach. But if they didn't get to business executive compromise, they didn't steal millions of dollars, they didn't dump all of my data, I didn't have a ransomware attack that like seriously shut my business down, I could not recover for 14 days. We got to stop telling ourselves that we failed. We got to start acknowledging that there are millions of automated attacks that run against your network every single day, every hour, every minute. So if you missed one, but you're still better today than you were yesterday, did you fail?
I just want to quantify that, right? Go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, I just want to take a moment to introduce Scott because he joined. Scott, you there?
Hey, Scott.
He's in a car.
Yeah, I made it.
He's either in the passenger seat or he's somewhere in Europe or Australia. And he's frozen. Okay, we'll try and get
that great service that we were talking about before the show.
That's right. All right, we'll try and get Scott back.
No, that is interesting. The quantitative piece, I think you're right around. We really need to change that dialogue and that mindset in InfoSec, and especially in our supply chain and expectations, right? Like, what if we normalize the fact that there's dwell time? What if we normalize that time to remediation versus time to detection, and that was the normal metric that we are quantifying, right? And leveraging those metrics rather than having that pie in the sky dream of, zero breach, zero trust, we just are secure. Like, inherently, we all know that's BS. So why do we all try and get to that point or think that we're there or somehow we are different or a special snowflake. Like, why can't we just normalize as an industry that that is not the case, and we are now leveraging metrics and normalizing the fact that we've got a conclusion that is different than the narrative we've been telling this entire time.
So, and I think this is just people as a whole tend to go like, what do I immediately understand and what can I immediately address? Like during incident response, it's highly emotional time. It's stressful. Everyone's running hot. If it's a big enough issue, you haven't had sleep, management's calling you all the time. You're not making the best decisions at that point. And you just want something that you can fix and show we're moving forward. We have to be able to step away from that and say, okay, we had this many issues. So for example, the Citrix bleed. When you got the incident contained, okay, so say you patched, you didn't have problems with it. Why not learn from someone else's lessons? You saw what someone else dealt with, how they got breached. Did you go back through and review to make sure that you improved your security in that area? Because an exposed VDI is going to be hit. And that code is hard to write securely. I don't care how many patches Citrix releases. That's a difficult code set. Given amount of inputs and outputs, the ways handling different data streams, it's just going to be hard, and it's got constant exposure. So it's really important at that point to say, yes, it's not the vulnerability to the NetScaler device. It's what the NetScaler device provides to the attacker. It's a place for them to get many types of credentials easily. Everyone's hitting it. I can't control, as a defender, if the system that's hitting my VDI is infected and can be used to transport through. So we know that attacks have happened this way against the VDI interface and the authentication, for example. What other things do I need to learn from attacks I've worked against someone else in my environment? Have I funded my Citrix team to make sure that they can get the updates all the time? Am I sending my IT admin team out to Citrix training or Okta training if they're using that to authenticate? So they're very, very familiar with it, and they can tell me what my options are as a defender.
I like the way you threat model, though, Bri. I think that's what you're kind of hitting on, is changing somewhat how we threat model and doing it better. I'll give you an example of something we haven't released yet, but it should come out today or tomorrow. I was looking at, and I don't know how to pronounce it. Is it Zixil? I call it Zixil. Is it Zixil?
The Zixil firewalls?
Yeah. Can we just, yeah. Okay, Zixil.
Zixil.
A one packet.
Oh, the stuff that the stuff that got hit in Denmark?
Yes.
That they had so much issue with?
One packet, UDP exploiting IPsec IKE v2 gives you remote root on the device. I'm not sure why more people aren't talking about this, because when I brought up with some of our researchers,
that is beautiful.
Yeah,
that is beautiful.
I was talking with some of my researchers earlier, and they were like, "Wait, why aren't more people talking about this? Because this is really bad." They're like, "Is there an exploit?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's a Metasploit." How about that?
Yeah. So Paul, hi guys. I gotta jump in. Yeah, sorry about that. I hit the wrong button right when you introduced me.
No
Great
worries.
timing. Here with my three favorite people. Thank you for coming on the show, Bri. Thank you, Tyler, for filling in for me. I appreciate that. You're amazing, as always. Look, like I'm starting to wonder if a lot of these bugs don't tie into something much bigger and way bigger than SecOps, which is that they're there on purpose. I mean, I'm just going to say it. I'll be the person in the room that says the thing and wears the tinfoil hat and says a single UDP packet that could do that.
Yeah. Right? So, but here's what I traced it back to, Scott, was a supply chain. Because back to Bri's point about complex software, I'm like, wait a minute. What I remember about IPsec, and I haven't done an implementation in a long time, is this really complicated. Like, I remember studying it when I took my SANS courses 20 plus years ago. I was like, there's a lot there. So if I'm a vendor with a firewall, am I going to go, yeah, we should write our own implementation of IPsec? Probably not. I'm probably going to go get that from somewhere else so that I don't have to write it. And my post kind of tangentially goes through, like, I'm pretty sure they got it from somewhere else. And like, here's some evidence to show that they got it from somewhere else. I don't know 100% if the somewhere else is where I think it is, but they got it from somewhere else, which means that, Bri, to your point,
their supply chain.
I gotta focus on that firewall, that complex software, and go, I need to threat model that and pay more attention to it in my security architecture. And two, what you were just saying, Bri, is the supply chain of it. Now, what else could have that particular vulnerable one packet UDP overflow in it. I don't know.
But you mean an S-bomb or an F-bomb that we have to keep track of all of the dependencies?
Now how do I go, again, it goes back to, I'm going to reverse engineer every piece of software and firmware in my environment to go look for it? Probably not.
So,
yes, that's what you have to do.
And so what if you're the asset owner? Like there was a sector cert, I think, from Denmark that was actually running those systems.
Yes. Yeah, and they got hit pretty bad. And they released a report recently. Yeah.
I didn't know it was a single UDP packet. That's interesting. But if Zixel had a third-party library that they were using or third-party code snippet, one of the things that I, as Denmark, and I'm saying this because I'm not in the middle of an internationally recognized incident and being like, holy cow, how do we recover? Mm-hmm. So I can say that very easily. Mm-hmm. I feel sorry for that team if that's really how how simple the exploit gets, like a UDP packet, now your root on an embedded network device.
That's a gateway firewall.
That's ugly. Mm-hmm. That's ugly.
So I mean that's ugly. But check this out. So if you look at like black tech, right? What tied to the Chinese government activity has been doing, hitting all sorts of edge devices, routing between subsidiaries on a branch in Japan to hit the subsidiary in China, U.S. to Japan, U.S. to China, etc. They're using all of these edge devices. A lot of them are Soho, like Zyzels, or like a lot of the so. There's probably 8 things that they've hit. But when you look into what they're doing, and what they've been doing at least since 2020, is they just literally go. Well, so when it's time to attack and do an objective, they go to this exploit POC site that's Chinese based. They grab whatever's the latest one, right? Whatever the top ones are with the highest degree of reliability as an exploit that works. Then they go over to ZoomEye, which is their version of Shodan, which has been around for 10 years. It's a Chinese university government been doing this. You always get way different results there from Shodan, for example. You go to ZoomEye and you look at the top ones that are being searched for, and there's your attack surface. And on any given Sunday, that's just what they do. That's what they did in April of 2021 when they first started all these campaigns. And whether it's a UDP packet or it's a code that's this long instead of one character, one packet long, all this stuff is becoming extremely easy to operationalize immediately. And then you have things like Russia's ScanV from the Vulkan file leaks, mm-hmm. that's continuously scanning and rooting boxes and having presence until the actor wants to do, the reactor being the Russian GRU, wants to use that point of presence. So I think, Bri, to your point earlier, we have to absolutely patch immediately. It can't be a, did SecOps do it? Did I send an email to NetSecOps to ask about it? No, it's like your hair's on fire, get it done right away, because that's the worst kind of breach on an edge device.
And that is awful. I mean, because you also know that whoever logs into it is going to be an admin. There's going to be multiple traffic pass-throughs on that gateway that could have like user authentication sessions that aren't handled correctly. So the value to the attacker is unquestionable. And let's be real, that was a beautiful attack strategy. It gets them where they want to be. It gets them easily, and they can live off the land from there. However, did critical impact occur because the Zixel box was popped? Or did critical impact occur because they had other business, legal, HR, control system, safety? What else happened to make it that bad? Because that's my next question. If zero breach is not a realistic security goal, I can't prevent an attack. I can't prevent someone from getting root, not given the attack technology today and the complexity of my attack surface and that first layer attack, especially something that's internet exposed. I can't do much there. But if I can shut them down from getting to what their critical, what the hacker's strategic goal is, I can prevent critical impact to my company or my organization, some of my systems, right? So what are we willing to accept from that? Because I can't keep running hair on fire and get to the midterm changes and response plans and long-term root cause analysis that gets me to real business process improvement. And that business process improvement, root cause analysis, allows us to identify and narrow the parts of the supply chain we need to worry about. So with the Denmark Zixel breach, I'd be really curious to see what their vendor approach is. Like, I would go back to the vendor and say, hey, if you're using third-party libraries and we think that was what was you be branded against? And I haven't looked at it, so I don't know for sure. So take that with a grain of salt. I would go back to Zixel and say, if you're not contributing to the third-party community libraries that you are using, why not? Because it's impacted me that you didn't. Can we do stuff like that long-term? Because short-term, our hair is on fire. And we can't really change that given the attack surface today and the ease of running attacks. The motivation between the nation state teams and increasingly the criminal teams who are making more money every year than drug trafficking. And there's got to be a balance between hair on fire and how do I improve the supply chain long term. There has to be. We have to get there.
Yeah, I think, having an SBOM is part of the answer, Bri, but what I also hear you saying is that what we used to term like defense in depth, which I think really it's kind of did like security architecture a disservice, right? I think people took defense in depth as like, oh, I need to go like buy a bunch of things to do like detection and response and like I'm good. But what I hear you saying is more tying it back to business processes, doing root cause analysis, getting better and constantly iterating, which I think, again, the defense in depth term doesn't do it justice in that one term.
Yeah, zero trust, same thing.
Yeah,
I read a Forrester paper when it came out in, I think, 2004 and loved it, right? That's a great concept. But zero trust today means user network. Okay, so what about database to database? Like, what if they jailbreak the zero trust client you're using? What if they've got firmware sitting on a system that you, as the zero trust application admin, logged into? Then what? Like,
what if they get in through the zero trust client?
Right.
Yeah. I wasn't going to go there. I was not going to go there.
I will.
I mean, because they're going to, right? It's hard to write software. That's a large scale software package. It's complex. It's got to do a lot of stuff. Just so it's easy to administer.
Remote administration tools is the big hot take right now, right? Like these things that we need to do business, and we've taken and accepted the business risk in order to conduct business. And we've implemented pretty good security in a lot of these, is also the Achilles heel and the single point of entry that provides wide scale, very privileged access.
Yeah, like
so, of course, their target.
BMCs are a great example of that too.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
How do I not trust my BMC? I mean, it's basically embedded inside of my hardware. It has tentacles inside of my hardware. So if an attacker gets there, it's game over. I mean, we've talked about examples on this show, certainly, of that going really wrong.
Wait, well, wasn't there a rumor
to answer?
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Scott.
No, you go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
Bri, you go.
I mean, you brought up like what? Oh, okay.
Okay, Scott, you go. I like this game. It's fun.
Bri, go for it. All right. I'm gonna listen to Paul. Paul, you got me going.
I think you're just getting caught off. But go ahead, Scott.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So to answer Bri's question, I think she asked the right question. Like, what is the long-term play here? How do we do this? Well, I think adding extra complexity is, like you're talking about zero trust, is always difficult to do, but also needed. But I think that complexity needs to come in the form of extremely strong AI and automation and autonomous systems. And I think that automation needs to be pushed upstream in the supply chain, is to the very, like you guys brought up BMCs, all the way up at the top, like at AMI, where this code has been developed and for a very long time. That's where you have to get like SaaS solutions that are AI based, actually working and actually implemented and actually audited by some form of enforcement, regulatory, multinational, multi-government organization whose job it is to protect global infrastructure. Because this is not a West versus East problem. This is a global problem, right? There's West versus East dynamics. We can talk about that all day long, and we often do. But to solve for the actual root cause, you have to go all the way up the supply chain and solve for it. And that's not going to happen until regulation happens, because it doesn't happen under the free market. That's clear after the last 30 years, right? Free market drivers cannot influence the digital supply chain when the margins are so low, the feature velocity and the competition is so fierce. In the middle of a chip war to boot, and then you add cybersecurity motives and motifs onto that, you get a cluster, right? So you have to solve for it at the very top. You have to use AI and automation, leverage it to its full current capacity, which The industry is abhorrently not doing. The gap is miles long, which we're not like a 3 out of 10. We're a 0 out of 10 in terms of what we could be doing in the supply chain, quite frankly.
And I agree with you.
I mean, this code is 20, 30 years old.
I agree with that. We need to have some automation that helps people because there's too much we have to look at. There's too much data we have to know. There's too many systems we have to know. But I would also tell you, okay, so with SolarWinds, the SEC just sued SolarWinds because it looks like their former leadership team knew there was a problem, sold off stock, and benefited from it. They hid. If this is true, they hid impact and affected everyone else. How do we change the people response? Because I worked a lot of, especially when I was a hosting company, I was managing about 60 instances a month because it was a specialty small, medium business. And leadership or the companies didn't have the money, didn't have the resources, or they just didn't care, right? As long as they could hide it, they didn't care. They weren't going to report. So things don't change. And if the SolarWinds, if that lawsuit is successful and the SEC is able to prove that they had knowledge that there was a supply chain, there was a breach, and that affected that as a critical supply chain component for federal governments, why is that just a civil suit, not a criminal suit? Like, we have to change the way people think about things so we can improve. Otherwise, IT teams, security teams are going to be overworked all the time and told work what's cool, work what leadership is exposed to. We're not going to do root cause analysis, and we're not going to see improvement.
Yeah, and what you're talking about,
the data-driven security.
Right, what you're talking about, Bri, is accountability with respect to the supply chain. And oftentimes I use the Spider-Man meme where there's multiple Spider-Mans pointing at each other when I talk about accountability, because that's often what happens at different scales, right? Sometimes, I mean, sometimes it's not malicious. There wasn't someone trying to hide something. We're just trying to figure out like who's accountable here and can help fix the problem, right? Other times, as could be the case with SolarWinds, there could be some essentially malicious activity, I think is what you're describing, right, in that latest lawsuit, trying to uncover that. And in either case, like, we need to figure it out for the supply chain, because accountability is huge. Because today, I mean, largely we just kind of pass the buck, right?
But if you're a software developer or a system administrator who has to do the patching, like, this is stuff you already have deployed. Yeah, we're going to patch it, and if we can't do it easily, we're just not going to deal with it. And I've talked to development teams where they have found bugs in third-party libraries, but they don't have enough time to get things fixed. They have to use the library because it's a dependency for another piece of code. We need to kind of stop that pace enough so we can do improvement. And this is one of the things for me that's interesting about working in ICS and OT. If you have repeated failures, like Lean Six Sigma type analysis is done, and identify repeated failures, I don't see more than 3 failures of the same kind on a line or in a plant the same way, because they stop and readjust and go back and do something. And that is a recognized, important part of their business. In IT and cybersecurity, that is not. We have to hit what we have, but once it's deployed, most people don't go back and refactor, don't go back and administer it well. So, and the software developers running the same thing. That part of it is going to have to be addressed as well. Like, how do we start saying it is important for you? Like, once you throw that system out there, you have to maintain it. And here's all the different ways we as a company or we as an organization feel like we need to. And we're going to value the people who do cleanup on all the systems that have ridiculous attack surface exposure or really old code or are running wide open to the internet. When are we going to start rewarding people for going back and cleaning that up and saying, yes, we understand that it doesn't contribute to new functionality or super shiny things that the C-suite likes or people can see, but it's important because we can't secure anything that's not administered cleanly. We can't. Most security incidents happen on systems that we knew there were a problem and we just couldn't get it fixed in time, or we couldn't get visibility and support to get it done.
Yeah, because refactoring or change carries that operational risk. I saw a great meme as a developer. I think all developers live this, right? You get your code working, and you're like, cool, it works. All right, let me go back in, let me refactor it so it's prettier. Whatever your reasons for refactoring. Like I've been in this situation where, like, refactor, and then it doesn't work anymore. Like, wait, what did I didn't. I think it's the same thing with IT teams too, right? You go back and you start refactoring, like making it like I got it working and it was kind of messy, but it works. And then you go and you change anything that you don't think is going to affect your operations, and it does.
So you know, Paul, you have a ton of experience in red teaming pen testing, and as you know, I ran global services for a while too, doing the same kind of work. And we would often find certain organizations that understood the need to have a check the checker balance. So you would hire a third party to check the work of the first external red teaming party to check the work of your red team that's internal. And when you look at most enterprises, it's like the CISO should not be the audit function that enforces and assures. The word assures is very important here. Like the SysOps team is not an assurance team, but the risk management team very well should be, because they should report to the CFO and actually manage enterprise or mission risk in a DoD context or federal context. So I don't think most organizations are structured. Some are, and they've only gotten the way out of necessity through having many bad days in a row, and the IT spend, cyber spend goes up 10x, and the OT spend goes up 30x on cyber. But those are the very few who are blessed with having been tripled by a cyber attack. But the rest don't realize they're still operating that cyber falls underneath the CISO falls underneath the CIO, and you're asking the SecOps teams to basically monitor and educate themselves. But that's not effective. I mean, whether it's at a global scale for supply chain we're talking about, or just an enterprise level, risk management needs to get in there and get an equally skilled red team themselves internally, as well as bring in third-party red teamers, et cetera, or code auditors, et cetera. So I think that the spend for cyber is just, it's a fraction of what it needs to be to actually solve this problem at the enterprise level.
Yeah, but then if you bring in a red team, how do you know that they've identified the highest priority issues? And they give you enough information that you can actually go through and say, this was the failure, right? Because I've gotten red team reports. I've gotten audit reports. I'm like, dude, okay, like, yeah, I see this happen, but this particular computer wasn't important to my environment. Or, yeah, you're scanned through false positives because, and I got in trouble, but you didn't log in as admin. So yeah, these are false positives, but I still got in trouble. We have to go from making that red team or threat-based attack information useful to a defender right away. Like, I love working with the red team guys, but very few of them actually write reports that are useful when it comes to fixing things. I usually end up getting stuck in doing that. Why is that allowed? Like, you have to be able to give me something that's useful. On the other hand, I've seen some really, really exceptionally well-written red team reports that companies were able to go back and do something right away. Like, that's part of the supply chain too. Like, people and process are equally as part of the supply chain as the software and tools we use. And Scott, you've heard me say this before. I don't care what the attackers can do. I set the entire parameter of what attacks will work against me. So I should know my technology, I should know my environment, and know what types of techniques are most useful against me and where those will be. Like, if you're going to lull bend me, and I know that VDIs, mobile device managers, edge network devices of whatever flavor, SSL VPNs, and third-party identity management services run on the cloud are primary entry points into my environment, have I gone back and looked and said, do I know these well enough to anticipate how the common attacks are going to be used against me? I, as a defender, should know that. And then a red team should come through and check me up and see if I actually did. Like,
that's assuming people are doing red teaming right? Like, this is where we go back to this industry. That's fair. We have villainized the blue teams, and we have showcased the red teams as kind of the the quarterback, the superstar, the varsity guy. Everyone wants to be a red teamer. Very few people need to be red teamers, and very few people are actually good enough to be red teamers. In order to be a good, effective red teamer, you need to be able to operationalize and articulate the way to fix the things and look at the things from a threat profiling standpoint with business in mind, and then do the operation and the threat risk profiling as you're doing an operation correctly. That's how red teaming should be done. Most red teamers are doing pen tests. Most pen testers are not good red teamers, and they've never been on the blue side or the defensive side. So that 25 years of building up with sysadmin, help desk, all the things that they should have been doing, they just come in and everyone wants to just be a red teamer and go break shit. Great. That's not exactly how we get good red teamers. That's how we get bad tests, and that's why we've gotten bad tests for so long.
And I would say that's one of the things I'm running into with, I started at a time when we really didn't have a lot of training, and you just had to know how stuff works so you could figure out how the attacks worked. I did not realize how valuable that was going to be. And here's the other thing that my team lead did. He told me that it had been suggested by Jason Larson that if we couldn't solve a problem the first time ourselves, we had to try to do it 3 times by ourselves before we could go ask someone else, like to spend the time learning it. I had no idea how important that was going to be for me. But our defenders suffer from the same thing. You can't get a degree out of college right now and not work network system or application administration or software development and come into security and be good. It's so much harder. I'm not saying it can't be done, but
yeah, everybody wants to do that. They want to short circuit this and jump right to the red teaming, because red teaming, we've made this a cool thing. We really need to change the framework and the mindset of who the superstars are that are doing the hard work that make a difference. Yes, I love breaking stuff. Don't get me wrong. I am the red teamer on the other side of this, having done this for so long, but that's not the right way to do it, and that's not how we fix an industry, and that's not how we get the next generation to a better spot. Let's change their mindset, change their frame, and make blue teaming cool again.
So Tyler, here's what's messing me up about this is that, being in cyber for a long time, we all agree that knowing how to code and develop is an important skill. But then you look at the leaders in the AI space and the futurists and the folks that are really on ground floor of that. And I'll tell you that in 5 years, very few kids will be coming out of school knowing at all how to program in any language. And what that does is abstract the understanding of how things are built, and everybody ends up at this high abstraction level, operating very efficiently. But the AI has done all the work to code, to orchestrate, to do all the things that build up an enterprise from hardware all the way up to software, right? So I think we have a big problem coming, because once kids are coming out of school learning how to prompt instead of code and getting really good at prompting and being very efficient at having successful careers, who's left to actually understand the underpinnings of compute? Because that's usually what the first thing a good hacker learns, or a red teamer, is the OSI model, etc., understanding the whole stack. If that goes away, I can't imagine how much legacy technology and code base and infrastructure that we're going to have to remedy without having any humans to do it.
Okay,
that's how you stifle innovation, right? Like this goes back to a lot of what's happened with like NASA and the ability to get super creative, and the people that have taken the time to really understand the fundamentals of laws and physics and push the boundaries of different things because they understand it, and they've got the understanding, the deep breadth of knowledge, not just in an intellectual way, but in a practical way. Without that, you can't get creative and come up with new ideas that then fit within that. Yes, I believe AI has a place. It's going to replace all the stuff we don't need to do that wastes our time. There are fundamental knowledge pieces that people need to understand and know and continue to learn. Otherwise, that innovation is stifled because there's no base knowledge, institutional knowledge, historical knowledge. All those things are the things that tie together in our brains, which cannot be emulated by modern-day computers or even supercomputers. Those things are the things that synapses end up magically pinning together, and innovation and creative ideas happen out of that no one ever thought possible or not even thinking about, because AI is abstracted to a layer in which they don't understand lower than that layer.
Well, I would argue we talked about that when all these IDEs came out, or Docker containers. Like, yes. I've run into people who have and they were hired to be an architect, that have a graduate degree in cybersecurity, but they have never built an operating system on hardware. They've kicked an Amazon instance. They've installed a VM image, but they didn't know that. So maybe encouraging them to, again, the root cause analysis process. You had a problem. You didn't understand how it worked. You don't know why it occurred. we have got to focus on that because AI is going to break sometimes too. It's not going to work right. I've talked to guys who are working on machine learning stuff, and they can't always troubleshoot their code. They can't always troubleshoot their results. Okay, if you can't do that, then are you going back and figuring out why you can't and improving that way? Because we had the same conversation with virtualization and Docker and moving to cloud services that we're having about AI and ML and people getting better. They've got to be able to problem solve.
Sorry.
Let's make that a bigger deal. If you can't get to root cause analysis, I'm going to make you as a manager do that. Or I, as a security operations person who identified something, I'm going to require that from my server, desktop administrator, my service administrator. I, as a security person, am responsible for doing that too.
Agreeing common sense and
it underscores
solving, that sounds like a good one.
It underscores the supply chain issue too, because as you rely more and more on these tools that are pre-built for you, you have to trust that those tools, like Docker's a great example. I see a lot of instances people just pull down a container and just trust whatever's in it, right? So I think we do need to have that notion that you have to understand the underpinnings to apply supply chain security, to be able to troubleshoot, as you point out, Bri. So unfortunately, we're out of time. But I want to thank our guest, Bri, for coming on the show. It was wonderful having you. Thank you, Scott and Tyler, for being on this episode with all of us. And that will conclude Below the Surface for today. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.